We are 25 hours and 27 minutes away from the launch of Fall of the Republic, premiering tomorrow at prisonplanet.tv. I'll definitely play some clips of the film tomorrow in the run-up to its premiere. I'm going to maybe play some next hour. It's just sometimes with our DVD playback system in here, it shudders a little bit and doesn't do it justice. I don't know if I want to premiere it that way. I may just put some sneak peeks up on prisonplanet.tv. We may play this never-before-seen Ventura interview where he talks about the new 9/11 revelations, talks about Obama's Peace Prize. So that's, in fact, I'll definitely do that next hour and your calls. David Ray Griffin's our guest. David, tell us about the name of your new book, how many 9/11 books you've written, and continue through the evidence of the fact that they blew those buildings to bits.
This is my, believe it or not, 8th 9/11 book, not counting the little book on Osama bin Laden. If you count it, that would make 9. But as I say, most people have told me this one is the most convincing because of the massive fraud and lies in the book. To deal with more of the omissions, another one of these, of course, is the evidence for explosives and thermitic materials in particular in the dust. And you know, but maybe not all your listeners know, this rather humorous story about a reporter who saw the discussion between Michael Newman of NIST, who handles public relations, and the Stephen Jones group, in which Jones and others had said, well, did you check the dust for thermite? And now thermite is a generic term which includes both ordinary and nanothermite. And they said no. Well, this reporter said, well, why didn't you? And Newman says, well, there's no use because there was no evidence of that. And she says, well, how do you know there was no evidence for it if you didn't look? And he said, look, it'd be a waste of time and the taxpayers' money to go looking for something that isn't there. And so this is a sample. You know, if people think NIST is this great organization with rigorous scientific method, all you have to do is read this book and you see that it's almost as laughable as that National Geographic program. And in fact, I quote a former scientist who worked at NIST. He worked there during part of the period they were working on the World Trade Center tower report, and he said, NIST has become totally politicized. And so I begin the book with that discussion, that NIST has become a political, not a scientific agency. And the rest of my book bears that out on every issue, whether you're talking about the origin of the fires, the temperatures the steel could have reached, or the nature of the collapse. And so besides ignoring the other evidence, of course, is, and I'm sure you've talked about it a lot on your show, is the new evidence of the nanothermite in the World Trade Center dust. And this is, I think, one of the two most convincing things to the ordinary person, because as Niels Harrit said when he was asked about this, the interviewer on Danish TV said, well, just because you found all that nanothermite in the dust, what makes you think that was what was used to bring down the buildings? And he said, well, why else would have it been there? I mean, we're not talking about a few specks. We're talking about an enormous amount of nanothermite that was still unexploded. And so they say, this is not the smoking gun. This is the loaded gun. The gun was still loaded. You put a torch to it, it explodes. And yet the defenders of the official story try to say, oh, this was just, these are red chips. That was just primer paint. Well, put a match to some primer paint and see if it explodes.
And then you have all the film footage from mainline TV crews of this white, yellow metal just pouring out. and dropping for hundreds and hundreds of feet when aluminum doesn't act in any way like that. And then you have them saying there was enough heat in Tower 1 and 2 to suddenly make the buildings explode top down. Meanwhile, columns, giant columns right next to men and women waving their shirts. Humans aren't burning. They're not melting, but giant columns right next to them are, after the fire department had reported that in both towers the fires were not as strong as they had been, and in one tower almost completely dissipating. We have the firefighter tapes.
Yeah. You know, and there's just example after example. Let's talk about the Van Jones affair for a second. The premise there of why he had to resign was that anybody who signed a document saying there should be a new investigation, therefore even just suggesting that maybe the official story wasn't true, that such a person is unworthy to be a public servant because there's something obviously wrong with his mind. Well, if people really know what the official story is, if they know how NIST explanation, which is the official story about the towers, if they know their explanation, there has to be something wrong with their minds if they believe that. And the most obvious example of this, now to skip to the final chapter of my book, is their own admission that the building came down in free fall. Now, we had been saying virtual free fall. They admitted, after David Chandler proved it, that the building came down in absolute free fall. Now, this is, of course, free fall through the air, not through a vacuum, so there's a slight resistance from the air. But if you had dropped a brick off the top of the building, at the same time the top floor of the building, the roof line, started coming down, for the first 2.25 seconds, the brick and the top floor of the building would have gone along at the same rate. Now, when NIST put out its preliminary report, what it called its draft for public comment in August of 2008, Shyam Sundar, in a technical briefing, explained why absolute freefall would be impossible. Because, he said, there are things in the way. And freefall means that the stuff coming down is not encountering anything. It's encountering zero resistance. And he said, well, you know, there's all that steel, all that concrete, all that stuff there. So that would use up energy moving that out of the way. So it couldn't be in free fall. Well, then David Chandler got on YouTube, put a piece on there, and slowed it down, measured it, and showed that it was absolute free fall for over 2 seconds.
And now NIST has had to change their story again and admit, okay, there was some free fall.
Yeah, but they didn't change their theory. They still have a theory of progressive collapse based on fire, and still deny, of course, that explosives were used. And, you know, we know, anybody who knows anything about these things knows that for this to come down with a horizontal roof line, virtually horizontal coming down, and in free fall, that means all 82 steel columns had to be removed simultaneously.
Well, David,
there's no way, even if this had been a towering inferno, that fire could have caused this. And so now what they have is an absolute contradiction in their final report. They've got a theory that says free fall is impossible, as Sundar himself had explained, and yet they admit as an empirical fact that free fall occurred. And one thing I pointed out in the book is very revealing. In the draft for public comment, they kept saying after every statement of this nature, and this is consistent with physical principles, and this is consistent with physical principles, sort of ad nauseum. In the final report, which came out in November, they removed all of those statements.
Okay, David.
So they were no longer claiming that their final report was consistent with the principles of physics.
Now, again, you're being very academic about this, and that's very important because that's who we want to really focus on this is scientists, researchers, scholars. But to put it in layman terms for camp-following debunkers who really think that the official story is 100% true, I think it's important to note here that 6 of the 10 commission members have made statements like fraud, cover-up, criminal cover-up. There should be a criminal investigation. The head lawyer, Farmers, got a book from the commission coming out saying total cover-up, a lie. We agreed day one to not tell the truth to the public.